بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم رب زدني علما.
The next thing related to the HSRP, we'll talk about the authentication. So general meaning of authentication is simply configuring some passwords. Now, in general, what is authentication? It's a method where we can configure the passwords. And if you type the correct password, if the password is correct, then only you will be able to log in on those things. You know the general meaning of authentication. Now, the same thing we can enable with HSRP also. So the authentication in HSRP is a feature which is typically to secure the communication between the gateways. Now, in our case, we are making these two gateways to talk to each other and form one group. And I want to make sure that these two devices will only form one group if they match the authentication on both the sides, which means if they have the same passwords on both the sides, then only. So this way we can ensure that only authorized routers can participate in the group. And this is basically preventing any unauthorized router, like someone adding one router and then advertising its priority value as 150 compared to 120. And then you might think, all the traffic to the internet will be going to this fake router or the rogue device. And that's something I don't want. Okay. I don't want any of the unauthorized routers to be added and participating in the HSRP group. Okay. This is possible, if someone is doing manually, it might be possible. And that's something we don't want. Okay, so why we use authentication? The simple reasons to prevent any unauthorized participation, which is basically like blocking any of the rogue devices from joining the HSRP group. We don't want any unauthorized router to become that. Additional terminology like integrity, ensuring that we have only trusted routers participate in the HSRP hello messages or the process. We don't want any other. And likewise, the same thing. This is also a way to protect your virtual IPs. Okay, so the virtual IP and the MAC address, we don't want that IPs to be known to anyone. So this simply, we don't want any other devices to take part in this. Now, mainly, if you talk about any authentication, similar to routing protocol authentication, here also we have a plain text authentication as well as MD5. MD5 is more secure. The plain text is nothing but we will be using a simple password. Let's say I'm using Cisco123 as a password on both the sides. And these passwords will be exchanged in a clear text, which means it's going to be exchanged in a clear text. Clear text means a plain text, we can say. There's no encryption. It's going to be exchanged in a clear text. Which means, if someone sitting on the network captures the packets, he can clearly see the password and he can simply add a rogue device and he can configure the same password, which is something possible. So most of the time, this is how we configure, but most of the time not recommended to use the plain text authentication. Instead, we use the MD5. MD5 is basically a hash key, we call it as nothing but encrypted key, where the password, like I'm still using the same Cisco123 as my password, let's say. So that's my password. So what we are doing is we will be using some password. The password similar, we will say like Cisco123 in terms of configuring the password. But the only difference is this password will be encrypted so that if someone captures the password or captures the HSRP messages, he won't be able to figure out the actual password. That's the main reason. Okay. So, like I said, the configuration is pretty simple. So always it's recommended to use MD5 authentication for best security. And one more thing, we need to make sure that we are using the same passwords on both the sides. So if there is a mismatch of the password, then the HSRP groups will not form. So while you are implementing the authentication, we have to make sure that we are using the same passwords on both the sides. That's a main thing we need to understand. Okay, so in terms of configuration wise, let's say the HSRP which we already have configured in our previous labs. Like if you try to see the configuration example here, this one, if I quickly see show run interface G0 by 0, where we already have the HSRP configurations done. So I'm going to configure the password as well. Let's say I just wanted to use the password. So what I can do is I can simply go and say standby, the same group number. We need to say authentication. Now, authentication, as I said, there are two options. We can either use a clear text or MD5. We prefer to use MD5, and then we need to define the key string. Now, key string is nothing but the password, the password what you want to give, and whatever the password you want to give, just type in the password, and make sure that when you are pressing enter, there is no space. Okay, so like I'm just using Cisco 123, a simple password. Now, whenever I configure on the router 1, immediately you will see there are some messages in the backend, the console messages. Now, these messages are important while troubleshooting. Whenever we are doing some troubleshooting, we will see these messages. As you can see, the HSRP state changes. And when you enable the debugs, you will see these console messages indicates that there is some authentication issue. Like here, you can see these messages, HSRP bad authentication. And the reason is simple. We did not configure the password. Even if you misconfigure the password, then also, these kind of messages will keep on coming up, which will make the HSRP unstable. So always remember, we need to make sure that we are using the same authentication method as well as the password is same on matching on both the sides. Now, once we do this configuration, what I'm expecting is the authentication messages should go away. And if you say show standby, in terms of verification, we should be able to see the states, and you can see the authentication is enabled with MD5. And most likely, if you generate the traffic, we should be able to reach out to the internet route. So as per my lab, I'm using 12.0.0.1. We must have reachability. Basically, you can see the reachability is there. And if you try to trace to 12.0.0.1, we should be able to reach out from the primary gateway, that is router 1. And of course, the failover and other things we already verified, so there's no need to verify other things. But as far as you can see, authentication is something, it's just a one-line additional command we need to add along with our HSRP configurations. This will ensure that you don't have any unauthorized device participating in the HSRP and advertising itself as a primary and then simply redirecting all the traffic to another side. That is what we call it as a denial of service kind of attacks. Just to prevent that, it's recommended to enable it. Even though if you don't enable, still it works. But the best practice is to always use the MD5 authentication for the best security. And while you're doing this, one need to keep in mind, we must have the same passwords on both the sides, case sensitive. That's something we need to keep in mind. Okay, so the authentication helps mainly to protect the network redundancy mechanism.